January 17, 1943, Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The snow fell in silence across the prairie, soft and weightless, dusting the barbed wire that stretched in neat geometric lines across the frozen earth. Beyond the fence, the land rolled outward in gentle waves, endless, empty, impossibly vast. Inside the compound, a young Wehrmacht corporal named Ernst Becker stood at the window of his barracks, his breath fogging the cold glass, watching the American planes dissolve into white. He had expected many things when he surrendered in Tunisia 6 months earlier. Humiliation, perhaps. Brutality, certainly. Starvation, most likely. But not this. Not silence. Not space. Not snow falling on a land that seemed to have no beginning and no ending. He pressed his palm against the window pane. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the fields and the wire and the watchtowers, a train whistle cut through the winter air. Long, mournful, utterly American. Ernst closed his eyes. He was 23 years old, a baker's son from Cologne, and he had spent the last 4 years believing he was fighting for civilization itself. Now he stood in the heart of what the Reich had taught him to call a mongrel nation, a decadent empire built on false promises and Jewish capital, and all he could think about was how much the snow reminded him of home. This is not a story of battles won or lost. It is not a tale of heroes and villains, though both walked these camps. This is the story of what happened when young men raised on the mythology of the thousand-year Reich were delivered into the hands of the country they had been trained to despise and discovered that everything they had been told was a lie. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States and distributed across hundreds of camps in 46 states. They came expecting the brutal vengeance of a nation corrupted by capitalism and race mixing. They found something far more unsettling. They found abundance. They found space. They found a people who did not seem to hate them at all. And in that discovery, the mythology of the Reich began to crack. The first transports arrived in the summer of 1943, fresh from the surrenders in North Africa. They came in trains and in ships, still wearing the dust of the desert, still half-starved from months of Rommel's collapsing supply lines. The men who stepped off those transports onto American soil carried with them a complex mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because they had survived. Dread, because they did not know what survival would cost them. The propaganda had been explicit. America was a nation without culture, without discipline, without soul. It was a place where Negroes and Jews conspired to enslave the white race, where women forgot their duties, where men grew soft on luxury and cowardice. The prisoners had heard the stories whispered among the ranks, that American soldiers were cowards who relied on machinery instead of spirit, that the American people were mongrels, that their cities were cesspools of degeneracy. Some believed it completely. Others believed it enough to be afraid. But fear is a fragile thing when confronted with breakfast. The first meal came as a shock, not because it was cruel, but because it was not. At Camp Clarinda, at Camp McLean in Texas, at Camp Como in Mississippi, at the dozens of smaller camps scattered across the Great Plains and the deserts and the mountains, the German prisoners sat down to their first American meal and found their hands trembling. White bread, real butter, coffee with sugar, bacon, eggs. Portions so large they seemed obscene. For men who had spent months eating sawdust bread and watery soup, who had watched their comrades die of dysentery and malnutrition in the sand, the abundance was incomprehensible. Ernst Becker, sitting at a long wooden table in the Clarinda mess hall, stared down at his tray and felt something twist inside his chest. This was not the meal of a nation on the edge of collapse. This was not the food of a people desperate and degenerate. This was something else entirely. The American guards watched them eat with expressions of detached curiosity. They did not gloat. They did not sneer. They simply stood at the edges of the room, rifles slung over their shoulders, occasionally exchanging quiet words. One of them, a tall man with a sun-weathered face and a rancher's hands, chewed a toothpick and looked out the window at the Iowa prairie. His name was Sergeant Tom Whitaker, and he had grown up 20 miles from this camp, in a farmhouse that still stood at the end of a gravel road. He had spent 2 years in the Pacific before being reassigned stateside, and he had seen enough death to understand what these German boys were feeling. He watched them eat, watched them struggle with the simple, terrible realization that they had been lied to, and he said nothing. Silence is a kind of mercy, but it is also a kind of teacher. The camps themselves were not prisons in the sense the Germans understood. There were fences, yes, and guards, and rules. But the camps were open in ways that seemed almost negligent. Men could walk the perimeter. They could sit in the sun. They could read, write letters, organize soccer games, put on plays. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, prisoners built an entire miniature village out of scrap wood, complete with a town square and a church. At Camp Hearn in Texas, they formed an orchestra. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, they published a newspaper in German, debating philosophy and politics and the future of Europe. The Americans allowed it all. They allowed it because they believed in something the prisoners did not yet understand. They believed that freedom, even in captivity, was a force more powerful than barbed wire. But freedom is a complicated gift for men who have been taught that freedom is weakness. Ernst Becker spent his first weeks at Camp Clarinda in a state of profound disorientation. He worked in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes, and in the evenings he sat with the other prisoners and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Some of the men clung to the old certainties. They whispered about Hitler's secret weapons, about the coming counteroffensive, about the inevitable victory that would free them and restore the Reich. Others grew quiet, introspective, uncertain. Ernst fell somewhere in between. He was not ready to abandon everything he had believed, but he could not ignore the evidence accumulating around him. The Americans were not cruel. They were not cowards. They did not seem to be suffering at all. In fact, they seemed almost indifferent to the war, as if the conflict that had consumed Europe was merely an inconvenience to them, a chore to be completed before returning to the business of living. One afternoon in late February, Ernst was assigned to a work detail outside the camp. A local farmer named Henry Thompson needed help repairing a barn roof damaged by winter storms, and the camp commandant had approved the request. Ernst and 3 other prisoners were loaded into the back of a truck and driven 15 miles into the countryside, accompanied by a single guard, a young private named Eddie Carson, who looked barely old enough to shave. The truck rumbled down dirt roads lined with fields still locked in frost, and Ernst watched the landscape unfold with the intensity of a man seeing color for the first time after years of darkness. The Thompson farm was modest. A 2-story house, a barn, a cluster of outbuildings, a few hundred acres of land stretching toward the horizon. Henry Thompson was in his 60s, a wiry man with hands like oak roots and a face carved by decades of sun and wind. He greeted the prisoners with a curt nod, showed them the damaged roof, and handed them tools. Then he went back to his work. No speeches, no warnings, no hostility. He treated them like hired labor, nothing more, nothing less. And for Ernst, that ordinariness was more shocking than any cruelty could have been. They worked through the afternoon, hammering shingles, replacing broken beams, their breath steaming in the cold air. Private Carson sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees, reading a battered paperback. At one point, Henry Thompson's wife, a small woman with gray hair and a kind face, brought out a tray of sandwiches and coffee. She set it on a wooden table near the barn and called out, "Food's ready when you are." She did not wait for thanks. She simply went back inside. Ernst and the others climbed down from the roof and stood around the table, staring at the sandwiches, thick slices of ham and cheese on soft white bread. and Ernst felt that same tightness in his chest, that same vertigo of dislocation. One of the other prisoners, a man named Klaus from Munich, picked up a sandwich and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes distant. "This is not real," he said quietly in German. "This cannot be real." But it was real. And that was the problem. By the spring of 1944, more than 200,000 German prisoners were working on American farms, in American forests, in American canneries and factories. The labor was voluntary, paid in scrip that could be used in the camp commissaries, and the work was desperately needed. With millions of American men overseas, the country faced severe labor shortages in agriculture and industry. The prisoners filled that gap. They picked cotton in Texas. They harvested sugar beets in Minnesota. They cut timber in Oregon. They worked alongside American civilians, under the same sun, breathing the same air. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between captor and captive began to blur. Ernst Becker returned to the Thompson farm every week throughout the spring and summer. The work was hard but honest, and the routine gave him something to anchor himself to. He learned the rhythms of the farm, the early mornings, the long afternoons, the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. He learned a few words of English, picked up from Private Carson and from Henry Thompson, who spoke in short, clipped sentences that left no room for ambiguity. He learned that Americans valued work above ideology, competence above rhetoric. And he learned, slowly, that the world was larger and stranger than the Reich had ever told him. One evening in June, as the sun set over the Iowa fields and the air filled with the scent of turned earth and growing corn, Henry Thompson invited the prisoners to sit on the porch and share a pitcher of cold water. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in its simplicity, but Ernst felt its weight. They sat in silence, these men from opposite sides of a war, and watched the sky turn gold and crimson and violet. Henry Thompson packed his pipe, lit it, and let the smoke drift into the evening air. "You boys work hard," he said finally, his voice rough but not unkind. "I respect that." Ernst did not know how to respond. Respect was not a word he had expected to hear from an American. Respect implied equality, recognition, humanity. He looked down at his hands, calloused, dirty, the hands of a laborer, and felt something shift inside him, some small piece of the old certainty crumbling away. But not all prisoners experienced this quiet transformation. The camps were not monoliths of re-education. They were microcosms of Germany itself, complete with ideological divisions, hierarchies, and violence. In many camps, hardcore Nazis maintained iron control over the other prisoners, enforcing loyalty to the Reich through intimidation, beatings, and even murder. Men who spoke favorably of America, who questioned the Führer, who expressed doubt about the war, were branded as traitors. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a prisoner named Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by his fellow inmates for allegedly informing on escape plans. At Camp Chesterfield in Missouri, prisoners formed secret courts to try and punish those deemed disloyal. The American authorities struggled to manage these internal conflicts, often unaware of the violence simmering beneath the surface. Ernst Becker witnessed this darkness firsthand. In the summer of 1944, a new group of prisoners arrived at Camp Clarinda, fresh from the fighting in France. Among them were SS men, hard-eyed and unrepentant, who immediately began asserting dominance. They held meetings in the barracks, organizing political lectures, demanding that the other prisoners maintain discipline and faith in the final victory. Ernst attended one of these meetings, more out of curiosity than conviction, and sat in the back while a former SS officer named Manfred Richter delivered a speech about the resilience of the German spirit, about the decadence of the West, about the sacred duty to resist. The words were familiar, polished, seductive. They promised meaning in a world that had become incomprehensibly complex. Some of the men listened with fervor. Others looked away. Ernst felt nothing, or rather, He felt the absence of something. The rhetoric that had once filled him with purpose now sounded hollow, performative, desperate. He thought of the Thompson farm, of the sandwiches and the cold water, of Henry Thompson's rough voice saying, "You boys work hard. I respect that." He thought of the Iowa prairie, endless and indifferent, a land so vast it made the ambitions of nations seem small and absurd. And he realized, with a quiet, irrevocable clarity, that he no longer believed. Disbelief is not the same as conversion. Ernst did not become an American. He did not abandon his identity or his past, but he could no longer accept the mythology that had defined his youth. The Reich had taught him that America was weak, that democracy was chaos, that abundance was decadence. And yet here he was, a prisoner in the heart of America, eating better than he had in years, working alongside people who treated him with indifference or kindness, but rarely cruelty, living in a nation that seemed almost incomprehensibly vast and self-sufficient. The contradiction was unbearable, and so, like thousands of other prisoners, Ernst chose a third path. He chose to wait, to observe, to let the war run its course and see what remained when the dust settled. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east, the Allies from the west. In the camps across America, the prisoners listened to the news with a mixture of resignation and dread. Some still clung to the hope of a miraculous reversal. Others accepted the inevitable with grim silence. The American guards watched them with something approaching pity. The war was ending, and everyone knew it. But no one knew what would come next. Ernst Becker spent that winter working in the camp library, cataloging books and helping other prisoners with their studies. The Americans had established education programs in many of the camps, offering courses in English, mathematics, history, and vocational skills. The goal was to prepare the prisoners for repatriation, to give them tools for rebuilding their shattered country. Ernst enrolled in an English class, partly out of boredom, partly out of a growing sense that the future, whatever it looked like, would require new languages, new ways of thinking. He studied late into the night, practicing pronunciation, memorizing vocabulary, writing clumsy sentences in a language that felt awkward and foreign on his tongue. The teacher was an American officer named Lieutenant Paul Hartman, a soft-spoken man from Pennsylvania who had studied German literature before the war. Hartman taught with patience and respect, treating the prisoners as students rather than enemies. He assigned readings from American authors, Whitman, Twain, Steinbeck, and encouraged discussions about democracy, individualism, and the American experiment. Some of the prisoners resented these lessons, viewing them as propaganda. Others listened with cautious interest. Ernst fell into the latter camp. He read Whitman's Song of Myself and struggled to comprehend a worldview so radically different from his own. The poem celebrated the self, the individual, the multiplicity of existence. It was chaotic, undisciplined, exuberant. It was everything the Reich had taught him to despise. And yet, sitting in the cold library with the Iowa wind howling outside, Ernst found himself moved by its strange, wild optimism. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The news reached Camp Clarinda in the afternoon, broadcast over the camp loudspeakers. The American guards cheered. Some of the prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Ernst walked out to the edge of the compound and stood by the fence, staring at the prairie. The snow was long gone now, replaced by green fields and wildflowers and the endless sky. Somewhere in Germany, the cities were burning. Somewhere, his family, if they still lived, were wandering through ruins. And here he was, alive, fed, safe, standing on the edge of a continent that seemed untouched by the war, watching the wind move through the grass like a living thing. He did not know what he felt. Grief, perhaps. Relief, certainly. But also something stranger, something harder to name. a sense of dislocation so profound it bordered on the existential. He had left Germany believing he was part of something greater than himself, a movement that would reshape the world. He had returned, or would return, to a nation defeated, broken, occupied. And in between, he had lived in America, had seen its power and its abundance, had been treated not as a monster, but as a man. The gap between what he had believed and what he had experienced was so vast he could not cross it. He could only stand at the edge and look across, and wonder what it meant. The repatriations began in the spring of 1946. The men were loaded onto trains and ships and sent back across the Atlantic, back to a Germany that no longer existed, back to a future that was uncertain and frightening. Ernst Becker left Camp Clarinda on a cold morning in April, carrying a small duffel bag with his possessions and a copy of Leaves of Grass that Lieutenant Hartmann had given him. He shook hands with Sergeant Whitaker, who told him, "Good luck, son," and nothing more. He climbed onto the train and watched Iowa disappear through the window, and he knew he would never see it again. He returned to Cologne and found his city in ruins. His father was dead. His mother and sister had survived, living in a basement with a dozen other families. There was no food, no work, no future. The occupation forces, British in his sector, were efficient but cold. Germany was divided, occupied, humiliated. The Reich that had promised eternity had lasted 12 years and left behind only ash. Ernst spent the next 2 years working in reconstruction, hauling rubble, rebuilding roads, trying to piece together a life from the fragments. He did not talk much about his time in America. When people asked, he said only that he had been treated well, that the Americans had been fair. He did not mention the Thompson farm, or the sandwiches, or the cold water on the porch. He did not mention the strange, quiet revelation that had come to him in Iowa, the understanding that the world was larger and more complex than any ideology could contain. These were private truths, too fragile to share. But he kept the book. And sometimes, late at night, when the memories of the war pressed too close, he opened it and read Whitman's wild, optimistic lines, and he remembered the prairie, the endless sky, the wind moving through the grass. He remembered what it felt like to stand in the heart of the country he had been taught to hate, and to realize that hate was a lie, that the world was too vast and too strange for such simple stories. By 1950, more than 300,000 German prisoners had passed through the American camp system and returned home. They carried with them a secret knowledge, a counter-narrative to the myths they had been raised on. They had seen America not as conquerors or tourists, but as captives, and they had seen it plain. They had eaten its food, worked its land, spoken with its people. They had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of propaganda. And what they found there was not weakness or decadence, but something far more unsettling. They found a nation so abundant, so vast, so confident in its own strength that it could afford to be generous to its enemies. This generosity was not altruism. It was strategy. The American government understood that the treatment of prisoners would shape the post-war order, would influence how Germans viewed the West, would serve as a weapon in the emerging Cold War. But strategy and kindness are not mutually exclusive. The men who ran the camps, who guarded the prisoners, who worked alongside them in the fields, they were not diplomats or propagandists. They were farmers and ranchers and small-town sheriffs, men who understood hard work and fairness and the basic dignity of labor. They treated the prisoners as they would treat hired hands, and in doing so, they communicated something that no propaganda campaign ever could. They communicated the lived reality of American values. The symbolic object that haunted the prisoners was not a weapon or a flag. It was bread. White bread, soft and abundant, appearing on their tables every day without fail. Bread had been sacred in Germany, rationed and precious, a measure of survival. In America, it was casual, disposable, taken for granted. The prisoners saved crusts in their pockets, unable to believe that more would come tomorrow. They wrote home about the bread, tried to explain to their families that the stories of American suffering were false, that the enemy was not starving, was not weak, was not on the verge of collapse. The bread became a symbol of everything they had misunderstood: the industrial capacity, the agricultural abundance, the sheer, overwhelming power of a nation that could feed its enemies better than the Reich had fed its soldiers. And the bread was just the beginning. The prisoners saw American factories producing tanks and planes and ships at a rate that seemed physically impossible. They saw American civilians driving automobiles, owning homes, living lives of comfort that even the German elite could not match. They saw a nation that had fought a two-front war across two oceans and had emerged not weakened, but stronger. The mythology of German superiority crumbled in the face of this abundance. The prisoners returned home and whispered to their children, to their neighbors, to anyone who would listen. "You don't understand. They are not like us. They have everything." This revelation had consequences. In the decades that followed, West Germany became one of America's closest allies, rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, integrated into NATO, transformed from enemy to partner. The prisoners who had seen America played a quiet role in this transformation. They were not the architects of the new Germany, but they were witnesses, and their testimony mattered. They had seen the alternative, had lived inside the American system, and they returned with a pragmatic understanding. Resistance was futile not because America was cruel, but because it was too powerful, too abundant, too sure of itself to be defeated by ideology. But there is a darker coda to this story. Not all prisoners returned home convinced. Some clung to the old beliefs, retreated into conspiracy theories, blamed betrayal and sabotage for the Reich's defeat. Some returned to Germany and joined neo-Nazi movements, tried to resurrect the dream. Others simply broke, unable to reconcile what they had believed with what they had seen, unable to build new identities from the ruins of the old. The camps did not transform every prisoner. Propaganda and belief are resilient, and the human mind is capable of extraordinary self-deception. But for enough men, for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, the experience was a crack in the edifice of certainty, a moment of doubt that could not be sealed. Ernst Becker never spoke publicly about his time in Iowa. He married in 1952, had 2 children, worked as a baker like his father before him. He lived a quiet, ordinary life in a Germany that was no longer his, in a world that had moved on from the dreams of his youth. He died in 1987, an old man in a peaceful country, and his children found the book among his possessions, a worn copy of Leaves of Grass with notes in the margins, German translations of phrases he had struggled to understand. They asked their mother about it, and she told them what she knew: that their father had been a prisoner in America, that he had worked on a farm in Iowa, that he had come home changed in ways he could never fully explain. The story of the German prisoners in America is not a story of conversion or redemption. It is a story of disillusionment, of the slow, painful process of unlearning lies. It is a story about the power of abundance, about how material reality can shatter ideology, about how the simple fact of a good meal can do more to undermine a totalitarian worldview than any argument or debate. The prisoners came to America expecting hell and found something far more disturbing. They found normalcy. They found a nation that did not need to hate them, that could afford to be indifferent, that was so secure in its own power it could treat its enemies with casual decency. And in that casualness lay the deepest lesson. The Reich had taught them that greatness required struggle, sacrifice, hatred. America showed them that greatness could be easy, that abundance could be the natural state of things, that a nation did not need to conquer the world to feel powerful. The prisoners returned home and carried this knowledge with them like a wound, a secret understanding that the future did not belong to ideologies of blood and soil, but to systems that could produce, that could feed, that could build. They had seen the future, and it was not glorious. It was simply, overwhelmingly, undeniably real. The prairie is still there, rolling outward in gentle waves, endless and indifferent. The camps are gone, the barracks torn down, the wire rolled up and sold for scrap. The men who lived there are gone too, prisoners and guards alike, their stories fading into the vast American silence. But the land remembers, the wind remembers, and somewhere in the collective memory of nations, the lesson remains that power is not measured in ideology or mythology, but in the simple, brutal fact of abundance. That freedom, even in captivity, is a force more transformative than any creed. That the future belongs not to those who can destroy, but to those who can feed, who can build, who can afford to be generous to their enemies. Ernst Becker stood at the fence in January 1943 and watched the snow fall on a land that seemed to have no ending. He did not know then what he was witnessing, but he knew, even in that first cold moment, that everything he had believed was about to change. And it did, not with speeches or arguments, not with violence or force, but with bread and silence and the vast, indifferent generosity of the American earth. That is the story, that is the truth, and it is more powerful than any lie the Reich ever told.